So the Euthyphro Dilemma? Yeah. Yeah, so the Euthyphro Dilemma. So is the pious pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's pious? Okay. Now notice, by the way, that Euthyphro goes for the realist option. The gods love the pious because it's pious. And the realist option promises all sorts of great explanatory power. And moreover, it seems to eliminate the worry that our normative values are not merely constructed whole cloth by our just simple contingent preferences, that they could just in some ways be the manifestations of certain kinds of arbitrary tastes or some status or something like that. And so the appeal of realism is right. And notice, by the way, that the realist program yields all sorts of benefits for critical reflection on debates and different takes on moral evaluation. That there's a fact of the matter, and like one side's right, one side's wrong. We can gather some evidence. The evidence is something that can presumably be shared, and is not just a matter of having certain kinds of preferences. And so notice, by the way, that there's a real appeal to the realist program. That you might say something like, look, murder's wrong because murder's wrong, not murder's wrong because some divine entity just doesn't like it, right? I mean, that's it seems backwards to say the other way, right? Why'd God say don't murder as opposed to sort of don't pick your nose? Or it's like, well, the murdering has got consequences that look like they're bad. It's like him not liking picking your nose. It's like, well, I just don't like the way you look whenever you do that. So it looks like there's something really appealing about the realist program there. The problem for realism is then explaining what those properties of those acts, like what is it then that makes piety piety? What makes piety the kind of thing that is valuable, that would be theologically appropriate? And the same thing goes with the moral properties or aesthetic properties or anything like that. What makes a morally good act morally good? That's the challenge of then being able to say, look, if you're a realist, now you're on the hook for telling me what those properties are and explaining not just what makes them the good, but then presumably also explaining how we got to see them as the good and why we like them and stuff like that. That's part of the story, right? If you're a realist, you say, the pious is pious. Why? Well, the gods love the pious because it's pious. And so you've got to be able to say, okay, look, I've got to be able to identify the property that makes them have that status. Moreover, I've got to explain how it affects us, fortuitously affects us, right? It's like, you can imagine that the pious is pious, and it's like, well, the pious is pious, but maybe we don't like it, right? And that's entirely possible. Like, sometimes doing the morally good thing sucks. Like, why do we like doing the morally good thing? Well, it's like, that's hard to figure too. But notice, by the way, that both sides have got that. If voluntarism, that the pious is the pious because the gods love it, then we're going to have another kind of problem. And the same thing goes with it, you might say, the voluntarist program then rooting in us. Why is murder wrong? Well, it's because we don't like it. We don't like it. So the realist line is, we don't like it because it's wrong, or is it wrong because we don't like it? That's the voluntarist line. And the thought is that, like, well, some people like it, right? Is that counter evidence? What is that? So the second kind of challenge is for the realist is to be able to say, okay, all right. So we see the benefit that comes from getting a kind of a stability, a kind of a deeper explanatory story, something not contingent and variable, and all that other stuff. That's great. But now tell us what those properties are, and also be able to give the story as to how it affects us, so that we give the assents and live our lives in light of it. The other part is a little bit easier. The voluntarist line is to say, no, we've got relatively stable preferences, And as a consequence of those preferences, we kind of institutionalize them on the basis of, you might say, sort of generalities about us. So we'd say something like, look, why is murder wrong? Well, for the most part, we don't like getting killed or the prospect of getting killed, and so as a consequence, we all got together and made a rule, and we pretty much just outvoted the ones that were like, nah, murder doesn't seem so bad, especially when I do it. We outvoted them, and we did our best to sideline them. And the same thing goes with a lot of other properties. So aesthetic properties have kind of got that, where it's like, well, for the most part, people like this, this kind of music or this kind of food, as opposed to the ones who like dog crap on their food or whatever, right? And you're like, well, that's gross. And it's gross because we don't like it. And there are enough of us. Right? And so you get the stability really from the sort of the stable nature of our numbers and the way that those things affect us. So there's a sense that the voluntarist line has got that with moral properties and with aesthetic properties, that you root it in our natures that are relatively stable and say, yeah, we kind of solve the variance problem and the variability problem with that. And notice, by the way, that one of the nice things about the voluntarist line is that it actually helps explain, whenever we go back to Euthyphro, we help actually be able to explain why Euthyphro can't stay a realist. That's one of the infuriating things about that dialogue. I mean, Euthyphro's a moron, and so you're like, man, why is Socrates just keep tonking this guy's head like a damn coconut? He's a moron. He's not a smart person who doesn't, and he's not a person who's used to thinking deeply about many things. And so it's not a surprise that Socrates is able to kind of screw him into the dirt. But in some ways, Euthyphro does show a kind of consistency. He doesn't seem to recognize it, but Euthyphro's a voluntarist. He thinks that he's following the will of the gods, and the gods' will seems to sort of ground everything. He kind of gets talked into being a realist by Socrates. In some ways, Euthyphro's dilemma and Socrates' argument for the realist line is more like a kind of more has the rhetorical force of kicking dust in someone's face and then pummeling them than actually arguing with them. And so it looks to me like Euthyphro's really a voluntarist who just gets convinced that realism should be right, but then consistently reverts back to his voluntarism. What's piety? Well, it's doing service to the gods. What's piety? Giving the gods the things that they like. And Socrates says, well, aren't you a realist? And Euthyphro's like, oh, well, I guess I'm... And he never goes back and says, you know what, maybe I should take the voluntarist line. Maybe the pious really is what the gods like. And that explains what's pious. And the fact that the gods disagree about that, hey man, that's just the nature of the gods, and that's kind of the web they weave for us, and that makes it a precarious place. That seems like a sort of a perfectly acceptable answer for Euthyphro to say in light of Olympianism. And I think that theists who think that there's just one God who would be the ground for that would be able to say a similar sort of thing, where it's like, look, could God have made murder wrong? And we say, yeah, he could have, but you know what? He loves us, and it looks like he thinks that declaring murder, that we shouldn't murder each other, makes it so that we're not killing each other and things like that. And he likes to see us, do more stuff. And he likes seeing that, and he made us to make it so that it seems like it would be terrible for him to say that murder would be wrong, but it would be perfectly possible for him to be able to do that. He just made us to recoil from the thought. Why? Because he made us to want to follow his orders. So it's not out of the realm of possibility to think that voluntarism, even on the theological scale, whenever you sort of put together all of the other facts that kind of get volited, that get willed by the gods, to make it a little bit more of a consistent and stable story. So where are my preferences? Where are my inclinations? Well, I kind of lean realist, but I feel the pull, and I feel the explanatory pull now of certain kinds of voluntarist explanations. And maybe a kind of a mixed story is appropriate. Maybe there is a sense in which there are real properties of things that give them a kind of quasi-demi-moral status. And then also we've got to kind of bring something to the table too, to make them accessible to us.